What the Senate Judiciary Committee did today crossed a line that the technology industry had hoped would hold for another election cycle. And when that line broke, the bill's sponsors did not hesitate. They responded with urgency, precision, and something rare in modern Washington, unity. For nearly 3 years now, there had been signals, not official statements, not formal committee schedules, just signals that the American Data Protection and Accountability Act was preparing for a moment that nobody on Capitol Hill could quite predict. Congress has been gridlocked, yes, but it has been consistently gridlocked in its approach to technology regulation. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a pattern, almost a choreography. Introduce the bill, hold a press conference, watch the lobbying money flow in, quietly table the discussion. But what set off alarm bells in Washington this week was that the pattern went silent. Staff members who monitor committee calendars know the indicators: the sudden cancellation of routine hearings, the late-night additions to committee agendas, the unusual number of closed-door briefings with agency officials, the sudden silence from industry trade groups that normally never stop talking. All of that went quiet. And whenever Congress goes quiet on a technology bill, it means something is about to get very loud. Insiders who had tracked this legislation since its introduction in the spring of 2022 told reporters something had shifted. The bill, originally drafted by a bipartisan coalition of senators who were frustrated by the absence of any comprehensive federal data privacy law, had been collecting dust in subcommittee for so long that some political observers had simply stopped counting the days. But behind the scenes, something was changing. Staff aides were working late, amendments were being circulated, and the lead sponsors, senators from both sides of the aisle who had staked professional reputations on this bill, were suddenly making themselves very available to the press. That is never an accident. Early Thursday morning, the Senate Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Privacy, Technology, and the Law circulated what sources described as a final markup draft, a revised version of the bill that included provisions not seen in over 18 months of public negotiation. These are the kinds of documents that congressional staff only distribute when they are signaling something very specific. A vote is imminent, the votes are counted, or both. Committee watchers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that this bill was moving. And when a piece of legislation shifts from dormant to active without a public explanation, even by a single procedural step, Washington pays attention. The revised draft, a 247-page document that now circulates under the working title, the American Data Privacy and Protection Act 2025 revision, contains language that goes significantly further than any previous version. It doesn't just create new privacy rights for consumers. It creates enforcement mechanisms. It creates liability frameworks. It creates something that no prior draft had ever included, a private right of action. That phrase, private right of action, is what made the technology industry's phones ring all at once Thursday morning, because a private right of action means that individuals, not just the federal government, can sue companies directly for violations. That is not a small change. That is a tectonic one. The reaction issued by the technology industry's largest trade associations on Thursday was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Briefing after briefing described the bill's latest provisions as unprecedented, aggressive, and perhaps most importantly, constitutionally untested in ways that could take years of litigation to resolve. But legislative momentum only works if the opposition can slow it down. The bill's sponsors did not slow down. In fact, their response today was among the most coordinated legislative pushes we have seen on a technology bill in over a decade. Here's what we know. Within hours of the markup draft being circulated, the bill's lead sponsor convened a press conference in the Senate's main press gallery. Not a side room, not a briefing room, but the main gallery. These weren't routine talking points. These were carefully prepared, legally precise statements delivered by senators who had spent months working with former FTC commissioners, consumer advocates, and constitutional law experts to anticipate every objection. They weren't reactive. They were ready. Tonight, multiple sources have confirmed that the subcommittee advanced the revised legislation through its first formal vote, including provisions that had recently been added to address concerns raised in the most recent round of stakeholder negotiations. The sponsors moved before the opposition could coordinate a unified counter-strategy. They locked in votes from the committee's center-left members. They locked in votes from the committee's libertarian-leaning members who were persuaded by the bill's preemption provisions. They locked in a crucial swing vote from a senator who had previously opposed every version of this bill by agreeing to narrow a key definition in Section 14 that had been the source of repeated objections. In other words, the bill's sponsors targeted the coalition's weak points and shored them up before the vote. The provision that would have made the bill operationally vulnerable in court, the section on standing for private plaintiffs, was rewritten with enough precision to survive initial legal challenges. This is what made the opposition's warning so urgent. The bill wasn't just symbolically advancing, it was structurally sound. It represented the kind of legislative vehicle that could survive judicial scrutiny if left to proceed without major amendment. And the bill's sponsors, understanding that fully, moved with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't try to ram through the version that would have collapsed under the weight of a First Amendment challenge. They didn't accept industry-drafted language that would have gutted the enforcement provisions. They hit the right amendments. They locked in the right votes. And here's where the story becomes even more consequential. Legal analysts now believe that the bill's latest version was specifically designed to test the limits of congressional authority over data practices following the Supreme Court's most recent decisions narrowing federal agency rulemaking power. The bill's sponsors wanted to see whether a statute passed by Congress directly, not delegated to an agency, could do what the FTC and FCC had repeatedly failed to accomplish through administrative rulemaking. Instead of asking the FTC to write the rules, Congress is writing the rules itself. That shift is subtle, but it is legally enormous. Former agency officials speaking with legal publications under anonymity described the bill's architecture as a workaround, a way to preserve strong privacy protections by anchoring them in statutory text rather than administrative interpretation. But the bill's sponsors proved today that this approach is both viable and constitutional. Their legal framework was not only carefully constructed, it was engineered so precisely that it incorporates language from prior Supreme Court rulings to preempt the most obvious judicial objections. That element matters because it shows legislative sophistication that has not always been present in prior technology regulation debates. It shows that the sponsors are not playing defense, they are playing offense. As reports continued coming in throughout Thursday, we learned more about the full scope of what this bill would actually do if it becomes law. And the scope is considerable. First, basically, the bill establishes for the first time a comprehensive federal baseline for consumer data privacy, meaning that for any American in any state, there would be a federal floor of rights that companies must respect regardless of what state law says or doesn't say. This affects every company that collects data on more than 100,000 individuals per year, a threshold that covers not just big tech, but mid-sized retail platforms, healthcare apps, insurance companies, and data brokers that most consumers have never heard of. Second, the bill creates a data protection agency, a new standalone federal body independent of the FTC with dedicated enforcement authority, a defined budget, and a mandate to issue rules within 18 months of enactment. This is not a minor bureaucratic addition. This is an agency that would, for the first time, have data protection as its sole mission. Not commerce, not competition, not financial regulation, data. Third, and most controversially, the bill includes that private right of action provision, giving individual consumers the ability to bring claims directly against companies for certain categories of violations, with statutory damages ranging from $100 to $1,000 per violation per affected individual. On a platform with 200 million users, that math gets alarming very quickly. Fourth, the bill imposes new requirements on what it calls high-risk data practices, including algorithmic decision-making that affects housing, employment, credit, and healthcare, and requires companies engaged in those practices to conduct and publish annual impact assessments. This wasn't just a data privacy bill anymore. This was a technology accountability bill. And technology accountability is the one thing the industry has struggled to accept since this conversation began years ago. For every regulatory proposal that advanced, the industry had countered with something that watered it down. Not this time. Remember, the technology industry thought federal privacy legislation would never get past the committee stage. They thought the absence of a unified Democratic and Republican position on preemption, on the question of whether federal law should override stronger state laws like California's CCPA, would keep this bill bottled up indefinitely. They thought the private right of action was too politically toxic to survive even a committee markup without being stripped out. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. The bill passed out of subcommittee with the private right of action intact. It passed with bipartisan support, something that almost no technology bill has managed in recent memory. And it passed with a momentum that, by every measure available to analysts watching the vote count, appears to be building rather than stalling. What makes this moment so significant and so unusual is that the bill's advancement happened at a time when Congress is under enormous pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Consumer advocacy groups want strong enforcement and robust private rights. State attorneys general want preemption language that doesn't strip them of the authority they've built under state privacy laws. Technology companies want maximum preemption with minimal liability. Small businesses want exemptions that protect them from the same compliance burdens as trillion-dollar corporations. And a growing block of lawmakers, some motivated by genuine concern, some by constituent pressure, some by the headlines generated by AI-related controversies, simply want to be able to say they did something. The bill's lead sponsors are balancing all of these demands while simultaneously navigating an election year environment in which any vote on a technology bill can be reframed by opponents in a dozen different ways. And when legislators in that position make sudden moves, when they call a markup without giving the opposition time to organize, they're not doing it from a position of idle confidence. They're doing it because they believe the window is open right now, and they know from experience how quickly windows close. The formal statement issued by the leading technology trade association on Thursday afternoon was not routine. It was not celebratory. It was, in the understated language of institutional communications, deeply concerned. Representatives from the industry's biggest lobbying arms said plainly that the bill's current provisions were inconsistent with a competitive and innovative digital economy. That is Washington language for, this bill, if it passes in its current form, will cost us billions of dollars, and we will fight it at every stage. You don't usually hear that specific framing from technology trade groups unless something they genuinely feared has just moved one step closer to becoming law. They're not panicking, but they are not relaxed. And the difference between those two states in a legislative fight of this scale is the difference between a bill that dies in full committee and a bill that reaches the Senate floor. Meanwhile, the bill's lead Senate sponsor addressed reporters in a direct, plainly worded statement that avoided the usual qualifications. She said, "For the first time, Americans will have the legal right to know what data is being collected about them, why it's being collected, and who it's being shared with." She said, for the first time, the burden will be on the companies, not the consumers, to justify why the data they collect is necessary. And she said, today's vote is one step. We know the road ahead is long, but we are walking it and we are not turning back. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a legislator who understands exactly how high the stakes have become and who has built enough of a coalition to feel confident saying them publicly. Here's what makes the situation even more consequential. This bill's advancement wasn't isolated from the broader legislative environment. Along with the Senate subcommittee vote, the House Energy and Commerce Committee announced Thursday that it would hold a parallel markup hearing on its own version of federal privacy legislation within the next 30 days. A coalition of 22 state attorneys general filed a joint letter supporting the Senate bill's preemption framework, a signal that the traditional coalition opposing federal preemption may be fracturing. And three of the country's largest technology companies that had previously opposed any version of federal privacy legislation, issued statements Thursday indicating they were open to constructive engagement with the current draft. That phrase, open to constructive engagement, is industry language for, we know this is moving, and we would rather help shape it than fight it from the outside. All of this happened within the same 24-hour window. When a piece of legislation moves multiple constituencies at once, it means something larger is underway. Legal analysts and legislative strategists are now considering several distinct scenarios for what happens next. One is that the bill continues advancing through full committee, reaches the Senate floor, and forces a floor vote before the end of the current legislative session, potentially becoming the first comprehensive federal privacy law in the country's history. Another is that the industry's lobbying pressure succeeds in extracting significant amendments, particularly to the private right of action and the scope of the new agency's authority, before the bill reaches the floor, producing a final version that is meaningfully weaker than what passed out of subcommittee today. A third possibility, the one that worries consumer advocates the most, is that the bill is used as leverage, advanced far enough to look credible, then quietly traded away as part of a broader congressional deal on something entirely unrelated to technology. Washington is full of bills that got within reach of passage and were handed to someone else as a bargaining chip. But today, the bill's sponsors moved in a way that made that third scenario harder to execute. They didn't accept a quiet backroom deal. They didn't water down the bill before the markup to make it easier to pass. They didn't use procedural delays to give the opposition more time to organize. They moved. What we're watching now is a test of whether Congress can still regulate industries that have grown more powerful than any single regulatory body was designed to handle. The technology industry wants to demonstrate that it remains capable of shaping and, where necessary, blocking federal legislation through the traditional tools of lobbying, campaign contributions, and regulatory capture. The bill's supporters want to show that elected officials acting on behalf of ordinary consumers retain the authority and the will to impose rules on industries that have spent years arguing they do not need rules. The federal judiciary wants to avoid receiving a statute so poorly drafted that it creates a decade of constitutional litigation, and the American public, the 331 million people whose data flows through these systems every single day, wants to know whether the government they elected is capable of doing something meaningful about the fact that their most personal information is bought, sold, analyzed, and weaponized without their knowledge or consent. Tonight, we've heard from sources inside the Judiciary Committee who are now monitoring the full committee's calendar closely. They say the full committee markup could be scheduled within the next 2 to 3 weeks, far faster than any previous version of this bill ever moved. They say the amendment negotiations currently underway focus primarily on 3 contested sections: the definition of sensitive data, the scope of the private right of action, and the timeline for the new agency's rulemaking authority. And they say the bill's sponsors' decision to advance the legislation before August recess is likely part of a deliberate strategy intended to force the full Senate to take a position before the fall campaign season makes any controversial vote politically impossible. But the opposition is not standing still. In fact, the opposition is mobilizing in ways that suggest they take this threat seriously, more seriously, perhaps, than any prior version of this legislation. Their response today, targeted, well-funded, and coordinated, sent a message to the bill's sponsors that the fight ahead will be harder than the fight that led to today's vote. And it sent a message to every consumer advocate, state AG, and privacy researcher who has spent years pushing for this moment. The window is open, but it will not stay open long. As the coming weeks unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly the opposition hopes to achieve and what the bill's sponsors are willing to give up to keep the coalition together. But what we do know is that today's subcommittee vote was timely in a way that may prove to have been decisive. It moved before the opposition could coalesce around a unified counter strategy. It demonstrated enough bipartisan support to survive the preemption debate that had derailed every previous effort. And it locked in a set of core provisions, particularly the private right of action and the new agency, that will now be extraordinarily difficult to remove without appearing to surrender the entire point of the bill. What happens next will depend on what the technology industry does in the next 30 days. If they choose to engage constructively, accepting the bill's core framework while negotiating narrower carve-outs and longer implementation timelines, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of a new era in American technology regulation. If they choose to fight, deploying every procedural, financial, and political tool available to stall, weaken, or kill the bill, the sponsors have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are ready to move again. And tonight, for the first time in 3 years, the technology industry appears to be on defense. Washington is watching very closely. And when Washington watches this closely, it means the calculation has shifted. It means the people writing the checks are choosing their next move very carefully. Because tonight, the industry learned something it may have forgotten somewhere in the years between its last defeat and this one. Laws written by elected officials for ordinary people can still move. Democracy, when it is paying attention, can still act, and the consumers who have been waiting for Washington to do something, anything, about the most invasive data ecosystem in human history are still watching. This story is far from over. The bill still faces the full committee, the full Senate, the House, a potential conference, a presidential signature. Every one of those stages is a battle. But tonight, one thing is clear. The bill that Washington forgot about just reminded everyone that it exists. The coalition that everyone said could never hold just held and advanced. And the moment that the technology industry had spent years trying to prevent just became the moment they will spend the next several weeks trying to survive. We will be here watching every amendment, every vote, and every backroom negotiation as the next phase of this historic fight begins.